All right, y'all, so we're going to start talking about evaluating sources. And evaluating sources is basically using critical thinking to determine whether or not the source that you find is both credible and appropriate for whatever you intend to use it for. Whenever I tell other people that I teach students about evaluating sources, they always get really excited and tell me how much of a needed skill that it is. And while that's definitely true, teaching about source evaluation has become incredibly tricky, and it's not the easiest skill to learn. So while we're going to talk about evaluating sources, and I'm going to teach you some different techniques to use for source evaluation, we're also going to take a bit of a bird's eye view on evaluating sources and talk about why it's become so tricky to teach to begin with. So we're going to start off our conversation about evaluating sources with a bit of an experiment. So what I'd like you to do is take a look at the photo on the screen. This photo depicts a picture of daisies that was supposedly taken at the site of the Fukushima nuclear power plant. So take a few minutes to look at this photo and then contemplate this question. Does this photo provide strong evidence about the conditions near the Fukushima nuclear power plant? Why or why not? Go ahead and pause the video for a few minutes if you need to think about it. Now, whether or not you answered the question correctly doesn't really matter. In fact, 4 in 10 people get this question incorrect when they're first asked it. But the answer is that no, it does not provide enough evidence. One key point is that there's no actual evidence that the photo was even taken at the Fukushima nuclear power plant to begin with. One professor of plant biology who looked at the photo also said, and I quote, "This is a pretty common mutation among daisies. I've seen this sporadically in areas not associated with nuclear radioactivity." He didn't rule out the possibility, but he did say that it was a common mutation. And this is just one example of where source evaluation can go wrong. Here are some other statistics that might be interesting to you. In a recent study from Stanford University, more than half of college students could not correctly identify the difference between a website that came from the American Academy of Pediatricians, which is the main professional organization for pediatricians across the United States, and a fringe source from a single-issue hate group that is comprised of pediatricians. In that same study, more than half of college students could not correctly identify that a tweet from the Center for American Progress, which is a left-leaning organization, had a political bias. And I'll stop picking on college students for a minute here because this is really a problem that is true of all adults. So for example, in a recent Pew survey, around a third of adults could not correctly identify the difference between factual statements and opinion statements in web sources. So as I mentioned earlier, there's something about evaluating sources that is really difficult. And even if most of us can get some of these questions right most of the time, there are still times when just about everyone can be fooled by a source, or at least read the source incorrectly and misrepresent the facts that are in the source. So thinking about misrepresenting the facts that are in a source, I think it's actually a really good idea when talking about evaluating sources to go ahead and go over some of these concepts. Earlier I mentioned that when I tell people that I teach about evaluating sources, they get pretty excited. A lot of that really has to do with the rise of what people are calling quote-unquote fake news. I'll be honest and say that I don't really like the term fake news because it's gotten way too politicized. And really what it's trying to get at are these concepts of misinformation and disinformation. So I'm going to pause here and define those because I think those are really important terms to understand. So misinformation is just inaccurate information. It is spread really quickly due to the dynamic nature of the internet, and it's often spread accidentally. So perhaps because I'm a parent, I think about the parent groups that I'm in on Facebook, where misinformation about things like vaccination spreads pretty quickly. A lot of times when people spread misinformation, it's because they actually believe it to be true. Other times they may just not read the entire article, and still other times they just may not completely understand the research that was conducted. Sometimes misinformation starts out as factual research, but it gets misinterpreted along the way. On the other hand, disinformation is actually false information that is deliberately spread to cause harm. Often, disinformation is spread by political groups or other groups with agendas as a tool to fuel information wars. And like I mentioned, fake news is just the phrase that caught on to describe misinformation and disinformation. We'll come back to these terms later when we talk about the psychology of evaluating sources. The big 3 takeaways that I want you to gather from this introduction is that the way that information is created, shared, and accessed is more dynamic than it's ever been. Largely due to the internet, it's now very easy to quickly share information with other people. whether that information is accurate or not. The second thing that I want you to take into consideration is that most people are overconfident in their ability to evaluate sources. This one is pretty hard for us to wrap our minds around. Most of us want to believe that we're actually really good at evaluating sources. However, even if we're good most of the time, there still might be times where we see a source and we don't fully understand or comprehend it before taking it to be true. This is something that everybody does. And again, later when we talk about the psychology behind this, that part will make a little bit more sense. And the last thing that I want us to get at, both from this introduction and from this whole unit, is that the way that we teach information and digital literacy really is not working. I'm still going to teach you a lot of the techniques that have historically been taught because I still think that they have value and that they're important to learn. But I also want you to consider why learning just those techniques has not been enough, and why large portions of the population are still unable to properly evaluate sources 100% of the time.